In the autumn of 1944, Japanese anti-aircraft crews stationed around Tokyo watched a new American bomber pass overhead at an altitude their guns simply could not reach. The aircraft flew so high that its silver fuselage appeared as little more than a tiny, glinting speck against the sky, leaving contrails that Japanese civilians below could watch drift slowly across the horizon for minutes at a time, completely untouched by the anti-aircraft fire bursting thousands of feet beneath it. Japanese fighter pilots scrambled to intercept these raids, found their own aircraft straining at the very edge of their operational ceiling, engines gasping in thin air, unable to climb high enough or fast enough to bring their guns to bear before fuel and oxygen forced them back down. This was the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, an aircraft so far beyond anything Japan's air defense network had been built to counter that its mere existence forced a complete rethinking of how the Pacific War's final year would be fought from the air. This is the story of how one bomber, developed at a cost that rivaled the atomic bomb program itself, rendered an entire national air defense system essentially helpless, and how the strategy built around it evolved into the deadliest bombing campaign in human history. The B-29 Superfortress began as one of the most expensive and technically ambitious weapons programs of the entire Second World War, its total development cost eventually exceeding even the enormous sums poured into the Manhattan Project that produced the atomic bomb. Boeing's design team built the aircraft around a set of specifications that, in 1940, had seemed almost fantastical. A bomber capable of carrying a heavy payload across distances of thousands of miles, flying at altitudes above 30,000 feet, where enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire of the era struggled to reach effectively, while keeping its 10-man crew alive and functional through a fully pressurized cabin, a genuine engineering novelty for a bomber of this size at the time. Achieving that combination of range, altitude, and payload required engines more powerful than almost anything else flying, and Wright's 18-cylinder R3350 engines, rushed into production before their reliability problems had been fully solved, gave the aircraft its performance at a real and sometimes deadly cost. Early B-29 squadrons lost aircraft to in-flight engine fires with a frequency serious enough that ground crews and air crew alike developed a grim, dark humor about the aircraft's tendency to catch fire before it ever encountered a single Japanese fighter. Boeing and Wright engineers spent much of 1944 working through a running series of modifications to reduce this risk, even as the aircraft was being rushed into frontline combat service, a pattern common to complex new weapons systems fielded under wartime urgency, where operational deployment and ongoing engineering fixes proceeded simultaneously, rather than one completing before the other began. The aircraft's defensive armament was as advanced as everything else about it. Rather than relying entirely on human gunners exposed in open turrets the way earlier American bombers had, the B-29 used remotely operated gun turrets controlled through an early analog fire control computer system, allowing gunners stationed inside the pressurized cabin to aim and fire turrets mounted elsewhere on the fuselage, with a level of coordination and accuracy that represented a genuine leap forward in bomber self-defense technology. The program's scale of investment reflected just how seriously American military planners took the strategic problem the B-29 was meant to solve. Unlike the European theater, where American and British bombers could operate from a dense network of airfields in England relatively close to German industrial targets, the vast distances of the Pacific meant that any aircraft capable of reaching the Japanese home islands from bases the United States could realistically hold needed range and altitude performance far beyond what any existing bomber offered. The B-29 was, in this sense, less an incremental improvement over earlier bombers like the B-17 and B-24 than an entirely new category of aircraft, purpose-built for a strategic problem unique to the geography of the war against Japan. The first B-29 raids against the Japanese home islands, flown beginning in the summer of 1944, from forward bases in China under an operation codenamed Matterhorn, exposed a problem that no amount of engineering had fully anticipated. The logistics of supplying bases in China, requiring fuel and bombs to be flown in over the Himalayan mountains from India at enormous cost and risk, proved so difficult to sustain that the operation's practical bombing output never came close to matching the resources invested in it. The strategic solution arrived only after American forces captured the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in the summer of 1944, close enough to Japan that B-29s could fly round-trip combat missions directly against the home islands without the impossible supply chain that had crippled operations from China. Even from the Marianas, the B-29's early combat record against Japan fell well short of what its designers and commanders had promised. General Haywood Hansell, commanding the 21st Bomber Command through the final months of 1944, attempted to employ the aircraft exactly as American strategic bombing doctrine specified: high altitude, daylight, precision attacks against specific industrial targets, using the Norden bomb sight to place bombs with the accuracy American planners had spent years developing doctrine around in Europe. Over Japan, this approach ran directly into a phenomenon American meteorologists had not fully anticipated: the jet stream, a band of extraordinarily powerful high-altitude winds that, over the Japanese home islands specifically, could exceed 200 miles per hour at the exact altitudes B-29 crews were flying their bombing runs. Bombardiers found their aircraft being pushed sideways and forward at speeds that made precise targeting through the Norden bomb sight nearly impossible, and bombing accuracy from these high-altitude daylight raids proved consistently frustratingly poor, with a large proportion of bombs missing their intended industrial targets by wide margins. Hansell himself was, by most accounts, deeply committed to the doctrine of precision daylight bombing on both strategic and moral grounds, having helped develop much of the theory behind it earlier in his career, and his removal from command was as much a philosophical defeat as a tactical one. He continued to believe, even after being replaced, that persistence with high-altitude precision methods would eventually overcome the jet stream problem through improved technique and equipment, a view that history did not ultimately vindicate, but that reflected a genuine and reasonable strategic conviction rather than simple stubbornness. His removal illustrates a recurring pattern in the American strategic bombing campaign against Japan. Doctrine developed and proven against one enemy, in one set of geographic and meteorological conditions, did not automatically transfer to a different enemy, fighting under entirely different circumstances. By January of 1945, with high-altitude precision bombing failing to produce results anywhere close to what had been promised, and with mounting pressure from Washington to demonstrate that the enormous investment in the B-29 program was producing meaningful results against Japan, Hansell was replaced by Major General Curtis LeMay, an officer who had already built a reputation in the European theater for a blunt, results-focused approach to strategic bombing problems. LeMay arrived in the Marianas and, after reviewing months of disappointing bombing results, made one of the most consequential tactical decisions of the entire Pacific Air War. LeMay concluded that the jet stream problem was essentially unsolvable at high altitude with the technology available, and that the entire strategic approach needed to change rather than be incrementally adjusted. His solution abandoned high-altitude daylight precision bombing almost entirely in favor of something radically different, stripping the B-29s of most of their defensive gun turrets and ammunition to reduce weight, loading them instead with incendiary bombs and sending them to attack Japanese cities at night, at altitudes as low as 5,000 to 9,000 feet, far below where the aircraft had originally been designed to operate, and, crucially, low enough to avoid the jet stream winds that had ruined high-altitude bombing accuracy for months. The tactical logic behind LeMay's decision rested on a specific and, to some of his own subordinate commanders, deeply unsettling calculation. Japanese night fighter defenses were poorly developed compared to those built by Germany over the course of the European Air War, largely because Japan had never faced sustained heavy night bombing before and had not invested comparably in radar-directed night interception. Japanese anti-aircraft artillery, similarly, was configured primarily to engage high-altitude targets, and was far less effective against bombers flying at the lower altitudes LeMay now proposed. And Japanese cities, built extensively from wood and paper construction in dense urban neighborhoods, were, in the blunt assessment LeMay's planning staff produced, exceptionally vulnerable to fire in a way that European cities, built predominantly from stone and brick, generally were not. LeMay's decision was, by his own later account, one of the more agonizing calculations he made during the war, not because he doubted its tactical soundness, but because he understood clearly what the human cost of the new approach would be. Stripping the aircraft of defensive guns to increase bomb load meant accepting greater risk to his own air crews, if Japanese defenses turned out to be more capable than his intelligence assessments suggested. And loading incendiary weapons specifically intended to ignite dense residential neighborhoods meant accepting, deliberately and knowingly, that the campaign's primary effect would fall heavily on civilian populations rather than exclusively on identifiable military and industrial targets. LeMay proceeded anyway, a decision that would define both the immediate military outcome of the campaign and the moral debate that has surrounded his legacy ever since. Japanese fighter pilots assigned to home defense squadrons during this period faced a problem that had no easy technical solution. Most Japanese interceptor aircraft, including capable fighters like the Nakajima Ki-84, had been designed and optimized for combat at altitudes well below where B-29s had originally been flying their high-altitude missions. And even Japan's dedicated high-altitude interceptors struggled with reliability and performance problems at the extreme ceiling the Superfortress operated at during the campaign's early months. Pilots who did manage to reach intercept altitude against high-flying B-29 formations described operating at the absolute edge of their aircraft's performance envelope, engines producing only a fraction of their sea-level power in the thin air, control surfaces sluggish, and pilots themselves suffering from oxygen deprivation and extreme cold in aircraft not well equipped for sustained high-altitude operation. When LeMay shifted tactics to low-altitude night raids, the tactical problem for Japanese air defense did not improve so much as it changed shape entirely. Japanese night fighter units, hastily adapted from day fighter airframes, with limited radar equipment, and even more limited training in night interception techniques, found themselves attempting to locate and engage individual bombers in complete darkness, guided by searchlights and anti-aircraft fire, that themselves struggled to track fast, low-flying aircraft approaching from unpredictable directions. Surviving accounts from Japanese anti-aircraft crews stationed around Tokyo during the March 1945 firebombing raids describe a chaotic, overwhelming scene. Dozens of bombers approaching simultaneously from multiple directions at an altitude their guns could engage, but arriving in numbers and with a coordinated timing that made effective concentrated fire against any single aircraft extremely difficult, all while the fires already ignited by earlier waves of incendiaries lit the sky brightly enough to silhouette anti-aircraft positions and complicate their own targeting. The gap between Japanese and American radar technology compounded these problems significantly. American B-29 formations, particularly by the later stages of the campaign, benefited from onboard radar systems that allowed navigators to locate targets and coordinate formation timing, even through cloud cover or complete darkness. A technological advantage Japanese home defense radar networks could not adequately counter. Japanese ground-based early warning radar existed, but suffered from limited range, coverage gaps, and integration problems that meant Japanese fighter controllers often could not vector interceptors to an accurate intercept point in time. especially at night, when visual identification of approaching bomber formations became effectively impossible until searchlights or existing fires provided illumination. The raid that followed, launched on the night of March 9th into March 10th of 1945 against Tokyo, became the single deadliest bombing raid of the entire Second World War, exceeding even the death tolls that would later result from the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki months afterward. Over 300 B-29s, flying at LeMay's newly ordered low altitude and stripped of much of their defensive armament, dropped incendiary bombs across a densely populated residential and industrial district of the city. The fires that resulted, fed by high winds and the wood and paper construction LeMay's planners had specifically targeted, merged into a firestorm that generated its own weather system, superheated winds strong enough to be recorded by American aircrew still overhead as violent turbulence, and temperatures that turned canals and rivers within the affected area into scenes survivors described as almost beyond comprehension. Japanese civilian casualties from that single night's raid numbered in the tens of thousands, a toll that Japanese air defense forces, overwhelmed by altitude, darkness, and sheer bomber numbers, had no meaningful ability to prevent once the aircraft reached the city. American losses that night were, by the standards of daylight strategic bombing raids over Europe, remarkably low, a direct result of LeMay's calculation that Japanese night air defense could not effectively contest the low-altitude approach even with the reduced defensive firepower American bombers now carried. The success, measured in the brutal terms of bombers lost versus damage inflicted, validated LeMay's tactical gamble in a way that reshaped the remainder of the American bombing campaign against Japan for the rest of the war. Survivors of the Tokyo firestorm. In accounts collected by both Japanese and American researchers in the decades after the war, described conditions that went beyond ordinary combat destruction into something closer to a natural disaster generated by human action. Canals boiling from the heat, entire families overtaken while attempting to flee through streets that had themselves become rivers of fire, and a death toll so immediate and overwhelming that accurate casualty counts in the raid's aftermath proved difficult for Japanese authorities to compile with any precision. The psychological impact on Japanese civilian morale, documented in post-war surveys conducted by American occupation authorities, compounded steadily with each subsequent incendiary raid against additional cities through the spring and summer of 1945, contributing to a growing sense among the Japanese population that continued military resistance offered no realistic protection against this specific form of attack. In the months following the Tokyo raid, LeMay's 21st Bomber Command extended the same low-altitude incendiary tactics to dozens of additional Japanese cities, systematically burning out industrial and urban areas across the home islands through the spring and summer of 1945, a campaign that inflicted casualties and physical destruction on a scale that, by most post-war estimates, exceeded the combined toll of the two atomic bombings, dropped later that same year. Japanese air defense never developed an effective countermeasure to the tactics LeMay had adopted, constrained by aircraft, radar, and training that had been built around a very different kind of threat than the one the B-29 campaign ultimately presented. By the war's final months, Japanese fighter interceptions of B-29 raids had become sporadic and largely ineffective, and Japanese civilians in target cities increasingly relied on evacuation and civil defense measures rather than any expectation that military air defense could meaningfully protect them. LeMay's own post-war career, notably, was not diminished by the controversy surrounding his wartime tactics. He went on to lead the Strategic Air Command during the early Cold War and eventually rose to Air Force Chief of Staff, a trajectory that reflected how thoroughly the American military establishment of the period had absorbed his results-oriented approach to strategic air power. Whatever discomfort individual officers or later historians might express, about the human cost of the methods that had produced those results over Japan in 1945. Curtis LeMay's reputation, both during and after the war, remained permanently entangled with the sheer scale of civilian destruction his tactical decisions produced, a legacy he himself addressed with characteristic bluntness in post-war interviews, acknowledging the tactics as brutal while defending them as the fastest available path to ending the war and, in his own calculation, avoiding the far higher casualties an eventual land invasion of Japan would have required on both sides. The B-29 itself, having been rushed into service through nearly 2 years of engineering problems and tactical false starts, ended the war as the aircraft most directly associated with American air power's final campaign against Japan, carrying not only the incendiary raids of the spring of 1945, but, months later, the atomic weapons that brought the war to its final and irrevocable end. There is a broader historical argument, still debated by military historians and ethicists alike, about how directly to draw a line from the Tokyo firebombing to the atomic bombings that followed months later, and it is worth presenting that debate honestly rather than flattening it into a single conclusion. Some historians argue the incendiary campaign represented an escalation in the acceptable treatment of civilian populations in wartime that made the subsequent use of atomic weapons a smaller moral step than it might otherwise have appeared, since American strategic bombing doctrine against Japan had already, by the time the atomic bombs were ready, fully embraced attacks that killed civilians at a scale the Tokyo raid demonstrated was achievable with conventional weapons alone. Other historians push back on this framing, arguing that the incendiary campaign and the atomic bombings, while connected through the same overarching strategic goal of ending the war as quickly as possible, involved distinct decision-making processes, different levels of political authorization, and different technological categories that should not be collapsed into a single continuous narrative. Both positions rest on evidence rather than speculation, and the debate itself remains one of the more serious and unresolved questions in the historiography of the Pacific War's final year. What is not seriously disputed, across nearly all historical accounts, is the specific tactical claim at the center of this story: that Japanese air defense, built around assumptions about altitude, daylight, and conventional bombing patterns that had governed most of the war up to that point, had no effective answer once LeMay's low-altitude, night, incendiary tactics were put into practice. The B-29, an aircraft whose own development had been defined by cost overruns, engine fires, and a strategic doctrine that initially failed to work as designed, ended the war as the single instrument most directly responsible for demonstrating that Japan's home islands could be struck at a scale and a level of destruction its military had no remaining capacity to prevent. If you want to understand how an aircraft nearly derailed by its own engines and defeated at high altitude by a wind pattern nobody had planned for, went on to render an entire nation's air defense obsolete, this is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater, told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.